meet the rest of you over at the Nature Center at 10:30. We're going to meet at the Center for Conservation, and you can tell people at the gate are expecting you. You can tell them I'm headed to the Center for Conservation. I'll point you down the right way. It's not a big place, but there are bushes in between all the buildings, and you can't see exactly. So they'll point you in the right direction. Okay, we are ready to talk about terrestrial ecosystems. Spent a week talking about conditions in water, and then today we're going to go back to that idea of biomes and that climate determines vegetation. Vegetation then determines kind of what biome or ecosystem that we have in a particular region. We're going to start by talking about the challenges that organisms face on land and how they can be a little bit different from what we saw in the water. And then we see then that organisms that live on land have different adaptations, and they've gone through a slightly different evolutionary history to meet those types of challenges. And we're going to look then at light and how light can vary. Mostly it's all about leaves. That's what we're going to start with here. We'll talk about light on land, just like we talked about light in water. And then we're going to talk about soil. And we're going to go back to some of those same things that we investigated in class on Friday, and we'll give you kind of the terminology and the jargon that goes along with them and some definitions for the things that we encountered in class on Friday. If we have time, I'll start talking about evolution at the end of class today. And so I'm in chapter 4 of our textbook, and we're going into chapter 5 of our textbook here in class, kind of this week. All right. Here we go. All right. So things that are different on land than in the water. Again, we as land organisms often take these factors for granted because our whole life is already built around meeting these types of challenges. But if we're coming from the water and we're starting out on land, these types of things had to be adapted to for organisms that came out of the water. And for both plants and animals, autotrophs and heterotrophs that we have in terrestrial ecosystems today, their evolutionary lineage looks to point that they came out of an aquatic ecosystem, most likely salt water, and then started to live on land. And so they have adapted to different pressures than their far back in time ancestors had that just lived in water. And one of the first of these differences is that instead of light and gases being scarce and having to dissolve or filter through water molecules, now organisms are bathed in all of the gases that they need. It's readily available. It's well mixed. Essentially, there's a ton of light that's available. We'll talk about what interferes with that today to some extent. And they don't have to kind of struggle to find these things. That's a good thing. Okay, that's what made life on land attractive to the organisms that were coming out of aquatic ecosystems. All of a sudden, they weren't competing for access to light and dissolved oxygen, dissolved carbon dioxide. It was there, ready for the taking. Okay. One thing that comes along with this, though, is that there's a difference in friction and drag processes between being in air molecules versus being in water molecules. And so even though we see that the adaptations are the same, essentially for streamlining, for things like both the flight and for swimming, the actual physical interactions are slightly different. And that leads to some just subtle variation in the adaptations that we see, again, for aerodynamics versus kind of fluid dynamics. The other thing that's a huge difference between life on land and life in the water is that just like gases and light are more abundant, water becomes much more scarce. Okay. When you live in water, you have all the water you could want. When you live on land, your access and competition for water becomes one of the dominant things that we see organisms show adaptations for. And we're going to see that organisms show adaptations not only for obtaining water, but for hanging on to water and preventing evaporation in water. So desiccation is a real problem on land that just doesn't happen in the water. The other thing that we see is that organisms on land have to fight gravity. Okay? If you're living in the water supports you. You might be interested in maintaining your density and buoyancy at a particular place in the water column, but the push of the water gives your body structure. Okay? On land, the air does not have the same density. It pushes on you, but not to the same extent as water molecules. And that if you want to have structure for motion, if you want to have structure to move things around in a larger body, you're going to need some type of support system on land. And so we don't see really the formation of cellulose. We don't see the formation of things like a kind of skeletal system until we kind of get into land organisms. Okay, there are deviations from that. Okay, we have bony fish. We know that different organisms have different types of exoskeletons that live in aquatic ecosystems, but they're much hardier. They're bigger, heftier structures on land in order to help with gravity. We also see on land, because we're not in water anymore, that there's a greater range and variability in temperature and precipitation in climate that organisms are exposed to on a daily basis, day to day, on a seasonal basis, and on a latitudinal basis. Remember that water has that high specific heat. It can absorb a lot of energy. It can slowly release a lot of energy to moderate temperature over time. When you're on land, without the water, you don't have that moderation of temperature from that surrounding environment. And so organisms, again, on land show different adaptations to maintaining homeostasis. They show a different need for water balance. They show a different need for ion balance than organisms that live in aquatic ecosystems. And so even though we can get things that we know are autotrophs in both these environments, we can get tall things that have a canopy and an understory, and kind of a mid-level in terms of ecosystems between a kelp forest and a redwood forest. The actual adaptations of the organisms are quite different because they're meeting different challenges with that environment. And again, the environment determines what types of organisms can live there. The organisms that live there feed back sometimes to modify that environment to make it easier for them to live there, harder for competitors to change the environment. But the starting things, the light, the dissolved gas, the temperature, the amount of water, the availability of nutrients, set the conditions and the resources that organisms then have to play on to both in land and okay, but it's just different on land. And again, for us, this is our home environment. But it was really different for those first organisms that were coming out onto land. And that's why some of the first organisms that came out were small and they had very high surface area to volume ratios and they were able to deal easily with these. Then once you start getting some specific adaptations for terrestrial life, the bigger organisms take over and have regulated those types of early organisms that lived on land to smaller niches than they had. Okay, let's start with light. And again, we think of light coming down onto the surface of the earth, and we know that it affects solar radiation. We know that it gives us temperature and it feeds into climate. This, in terms of light, we want to think again in terms of what's available to organisms, and particularly autotrophs, plants, at a particular location. Okay? So just like in the water column, the quantity and the quality of light is going to vary where you were, how deep you were in the water column. The quantity and the quality of light that's available to an organism on land is also going to vary. Okay? And I think it's either too low or too high. It makes certain noise. It's not on the little clicker thing that makes it easy to put it right where you want it. Okay, anyway. So light doesn't vary so much with depth on land. It's there. It does vary with latitude, just like it would in an aquatic ecosystem. There's more light available at the equator than there is at the poles. Light quantity is going to vary by season. When is there more light in terms of seasons? Summer. When is there less light? Winter, because we're tilted and we're rotating around the sun on a non-circular orbit. Okay. That affects the quantity of light. The quantity and the quality of light is also affected by the types of plants that grow. And the first thing I want you to recognize is that we talk about plants and autotrophs, and we can put them as that big group. But this is where it starts to matter exactly what species are there. Okay? And the first way that it matters is by the quantity of light that's actually available through the ecosystem depends on the exact species of plant that's there. Because the leaf shape and the number of leaves will affect the quantity of light that makes it, from the surface of the plant down to the floor, to the actual soil surface. Okay. In essence, the more leaves you got, the bigger those individual leaves are, the more incoming light gets absorbed by those leaves. And the less is available to actually filter down to plants underneath and to the soil surface itself. If your leaves are sparser or they're thinner, look, more light makes it down to that kind of understory area. Okay? If you have really thick plant growth, you'll have just a little tiny bit of total available light that makes it down to the actual soil. But in this case, with these kinds of grasses growing, a tremendous amount of more light actually makes it down into that understory than if you're in a forest with these big tall plants and these big leaves. That affects the quantity of light that's available for organisms then that are growing kind of below these bigger types of plants. Okay, does everybody get it? We're going to see a similar thing when it comes kind of to water, that, the bigger, more plants you have, the more infiltration you have, the less runoff you have, the less plants you have, the less infiltration, the more runoff you have. But it matters what plant is there as to the quantity of light that actually hits down to the surface and where it actually goes in terms of into autotrophs or not. Okay, the next thing that affects light is the plant cover. So the type of plant will affect how much light gets through. The number of leaves that are out there by a given type of plant will also affect the quantity and the quality of light that gets through. Okay? When we talk about plant cover, we often are measuring what we call the density of leaves, and we measure it by what we call the leaf area index, or LAI. And this isn't something that you run into terribly frequently unless you go into agriculture or forestry management. But in those instances, leaf area index, the amount of plant cover, are things that we use to compare and contrast different environments. And they can be used to show us between healthy and an impacted or degraded ecosystem, these types of measurements. And essentially what leaf area index is looking at is we're looking at the total area covered by leaves compared to the ground area underneath. Okay. And so if there's the same amount of leaf cover as there is surface area underneath that tree, it's a 1-to-1 ratio, and your leaf area index is 1. If there's a whole bunch of overlapping leaves, that means that you're going to have more leaf area coverage than the actual ground underneath, and you're going to get a higher leaf area index. Okay, like a leaf area index of 3 means there's 3 times as many area in leaves above it as there is ground area underneath that tree. Okay. At the same time, you can imagine if you get a leaf area index that's 0.5, it means that only half of the area on the ground is actually covered by leaves up above. Okay. Is everybody with me? Okay. Larger numbers mean more leaves per unit ground area. Numbers between 0 and 1 mean there's less leaves above in ground area. Okay. What season of the year would you expect to have the highest leaf area index or density of leaves? Summer. Okay. When the trees are all leafed out, when the plants have all their leaves, you're going to have a higher leaf area index than in wintertime. And again, particularly in deciduous environments where all the plants go dormant and they lose their leaves, the leaf area index will vary by season. It will go way down in wintertime. That might be different in a tropical environment. In a tropical environment, during the wet season, really high density of leaves, leaf area index. During the dry season, leaf area index might fall off. If you have a high leaf area index, what does that mean for the amount of light that's getting down here to the soil surface? A high leaf area index. Less light, right. A high leaf area index means that you've got a ton of density of leaves compared to the ground, and you should be interrupting and absorbing a ton of that incoming light, and less should be getting to the surface. The opposite then is true if you have a low leaf area index. There's more light in quantity that's getting down there to the surface or to the understory. You can start to think about this in terms then of organisms gaining access to light. They want to grow tall and they want to put out lots of leaves so that they can get access to the light before it gets filtered out and caught by somebody else. In springtime, when the trees are just starting to leaf out, you may notice that in our region we get a ton of these little fast-growing plants that grow up in the understory as they have access to light, and then once the leaves come out, they die down back because they don't have access to light to photosynthesize. And their whole life cycle is adapted to grow really fast early spring and then die back and be dormant the rest of the year, and then be ready to grow again really fast. So the quantity of light is going to vary with the density of leaves. It's going to vary with the type of leaf that the plant actually has. And we're just talking quantity here, and we're going to talk about quality in terms of light wavelength in just a second. Okay, cool. And it's something that you know. We walked into the forest last week and we measured soil surface light levels. It was lower in the forest, so we had a high density of leaves, and when we were out in the wetland or in the light level of the surface. Okay, all right. So this is the seasonal variation in plant cover and density of leaves. We're looking at the proportion of available light in terms of photosynthetically available light, so those light wavelengths that actually are captured by chlorophyll and used to do photosynthesis. And we see that in the winter months. Okay, these are all the January, February, March, April, November, December lines. There's a lower leaf area index and a higher